Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, and I direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Carl Hoffman's Liars Circus and Steve Benen's The Impostors, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until, after over 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors like Carl and Steve, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so appreciative of it. So, tonight we are excited to have with us Carl Hoffman and Steve Benen for a double book launch. Carl Hoffman is a former contributing editor at Wired and National Geographic Traveler and has traveled on assignment to 80 countries. He is the author of 5 books. Savage Harvest was a New York Times editor's choice, a New York Times bestseller, a Washington Post notable book of the year, and has been translated into 9 languages. The Last Wild Men of Borneo was a finalist for the Banff Mountain Book Competition and an Edgar Award. The Lunatic Express was named one of the 10 best books of the year by the Wall Street Journal. Tonight marks the launch of his latest book, Liars Circus, a strange and terrifying journey into the upside-down world of Trump's MAGA rallies. Steve Benen is a producer on the Rachel Maddow Show, and author of the Maddow blog. Benen's articles and op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Monthly, The American Prospect, Salon.com, and other publications. For his work on the Rachel Maddow Show, he has received 2 Emmy Awards and has been nominated for 3 more. Tonight is an event for his new book, The Impostors, How the Republicans Stopped Governing and Seized American Politics. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Steve and Carl to the stage.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's great to be here. I thank the Strand for inviting us. Carl, congratulations on the launch of your book. I had a chance to read it last week. It coincided for me with the Republican National Convention, which made for an interesting experience watching the convention and reading your book at the same time. And one of the things that I saw at the convention that I thought kind of dovetailed well with the book was that at the convention, Republicans were acting as if Trump was basically the country, that there really is no distinction between what's good for the United States and what's good for the president. And I think that I picked up on the same kind of theme with when reading your book and reading what people were saying to you at the rallies. And I'm wondering, do you think that those 2 points are more or less the same, that those 2 threads kind of tie together? And if so, what does it say about Trump and what does it say about them?
Well, I think, clearly, Trump's whole thing has been to kind of meld and confuse the state with the man. And if you don't support Trump, you're, anti-American, you're a loser. You're either a winner or a loser in Trump's world. And that at the rallies, that's really, really apparent. When you go, from the very first rally I went into in Minneapolis in October, I was struck by this whole I was struck by something that I think we saw at the convention this last week too, which was just, and this surprised me, this idea that, Trump appeared big to me. He's a big man physically, but he appeared big. He's like up there on the stage and he's incredibly self-confident and he looks strong in this kind of sort of third world strongman, Mobutu-like way. And he grows, this crowd is there, this wild crowd mob that's screaming for him. And he kind of grows and he gets bigger and bigger. And I was shocked by that when I first saw it, because you hear about these things, but to really see it, and I'm not on his team, but yet I felt that power. And I think that over the last 3 months or so, or 4 or 5 months now in COVID times, Trump has been on the ropes and he's been in the background. He hasn't had that screaming mob. He's like a balloon with a big hole in it, let's face it, and that he needs that crowd, those screaming people, or the air that inflates him, that makes him big. And so suddenly we saw at the convention this sort of reinflation, especially like the last night. And so, he gets big, and to his followers, he is the state for sure. I mean, it's classic sort of authoritarian right-wing populism. And if you oppose him, you're a traitor. And so all those things come into play in a powerful way and are really visible in the rallies. And I think they speak to things that you talk about in your book as well.
I was thinking about the time during the COVID crisis when Trump basically had to give up the rallies, but then he tried to substitute them with the press briefings. So there was a point in which almost every weekday, or including some weekends, Trump would go to the White House briefing room, he'd stand behind the podium, and his team. Go ahead.
Yeah, and people, there was this line that like the press briefing was the new rally.
Right.
And it really wasn't. It was like he was trying for it, but he had his crowd was, skeptical journalists. I mean,
exactly.
It's not the same thing as what inflates Trump is, thousands of people screaming for him. At a Trump rally, I mean, there's so many things, but, there'll be a moment of silence, and a grown man, burly guy will call out in the middle of that moment, "I love you." And, we can laugh about it, but it speaks to the power that Trump has and the love. I was in the parking lot. I spent about I spent about 52 hours in the parking lot tailgating for the Tupelo, Mississippi rally. And, at one point there was a guy, there was the crew setting up the fencing and everything. And this guy in a pickup truck, sort of 60-year-old burly guy in a Carhartt suit. And he sort of drove past, and we meaning, us super fans who had been out there and suffering in the cold and wind and rain. And we started talking to him, and he said, I wouldn't have believed this if I hadn't heard it with my own ears. He said, I love Trump so much, I would walk behind him and pick up his poop. And again, we laugh at that, but that's serious. There are tens of millions of people who feel that way about Trump, and he speaks to them, and he articulates their distress.
Well, let's pick up on that for a second, because when I was reading the book and I'm hearing and reading about these perspectives and their points of view, I feel like there are certain threads that were kind of tying a lot of these people together. So, for example, on conspiracy theories, the president just this week is the Antifa plane and the dark forces that he says are controlling the streets. I mean, the president's embrace of conspiracy theories is well documented. But I think that I felt like there was a mirror image of those conspiracy theories with his followers, with the people that you were with at these rallies. Do you think that is that the tie that binds? Is that one of the main things that kind of draws that maintains that connection between the follower and the leader?
Well, I think I should say, as I said about Tupelo, the sort of basis of my book is that I kind of joined the super fans, and I ended up hanging out, about 170 hours in parking lots and with these guys. I was the sixth in line in Tupelo, and then from then on, I was buddies with these people, and with Rick Snowden, who's been to more Trump rallies than anyone in the history of the world. Tonight in Pennsylvania is his 68th rally. He was first in line. Well, I think he was second in line with Rick Frazier, who was first, his 23rd rally. So, and then once I sort of joined these guys, they texted me and, would save my place in line. I'd say there. So that's what I did. That's how all this came out. And, the thing is that people don't read the news. I don't know what chicken, it's hard to pinpoint chicken and egg, but people live in this, I mean, you know, the subtitle of my book is this upside down world, and people live in this, in a bubble, in this upside down world in which, you know, everything is a conspiracy theory, and they don't read the news, and they say to you, you know, if you say, well, you know, how do you, you know, where do you get your news? And they say, well, they do their own investigation, their own research, which is the worst thing in the world, because that means they're getting all of their news from social media, from Facebook, from Twitter, and not reading. You know, a lot of people don't even watch Fox News, or they watch, you know, One American News now somewhat, and they live in this world in which everything is a conspiracy. So it's a, you know, your image of a mirror, you know, Trump is mirroring them and they're mirroring him, but they're all in the same upside down world. I mean, and it's like that literally and culturally. I mean, you know, at a Trump rally, there's wild music playing, you know, rock and roll, not sappy country music. And, you know, the biggest song, the song that gets people just going the wildest is, you know, the Village People's YMCA. And, you know,
they don't understand.
Mississippi, you know, there'll be thousands of evangelicals. And right before Pence comes out, you know, literally the YMCA, and people are pantomiming the words YMCA. Right. And then the next person who comes out is Pence, who, you know, is adamantly, you know, who says being gay is a sin. I mean, that's this world, and it's always reinforcing, you know, itself. And I think it speaks to what we're going to talk about in your book, where you talk about, you know, this post-policy world where, you know, policy itself there is no policy. It's all right. Sort of a show. And I think, you know, I would say to you, is this an outgrowth? Is Trump a natural outgrowth of this sort of post-policy world in which there's nothing, no reality, there's only show?
Well, right. You know, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was this notion of how do the attendees at the events, how do this hardcore base, how do they respond to Trump's failures, their policy failures in governance, things like coronavirus and other things. And so my assumption was, before I was reading your book, that they would de-emphasize, or they would reprioritize, or they would somehow rationalize and say that, well, this is Democrats' fault or the media's fault or whomever. But after reading the book and from hearing what you're saying, it's almost as if they're not even aware of the failures. They don't.
Oh, absolutely. It's not almost as if they're unaware of the failures. They don't think there are failures, and they think, I mean, what Trump says about his Ukraine call is that it was a perfect call. And that's what he says over, you know, I don't know if he talks about it now at the rallies, but in those days, during the impeachment days, it's just a very easy example. It's a perfect call, and people think it's a perfect call, and they think that, okay, back up a minute. There is a jumbotron, a giant screen that is set up outside in the parking lot of the rallies. And it goes up it goes up the day before, but it goes on around 7 or 7:30 in the morning on the day of the rallies. And it's on an hour-long loop, and it goes and goes and goes. And there, you know, all kinds of, I mean, all the Trump things are said there, but there was this one thing, there's one very clear word that stood out, or sentence that stood out to me, which was, you know, Brad Parscale, who used to be his campaign manager, saying, the biggest threat to American democracy is the fake news. And that is hammered home over and over and over again. You know, we see it in like him saying it or something, and the quoted in the newspaper, but, you know, Trump's base, who number in the tens of millions, believe that the Washington Post and New York Times make up the news, that it's fake news and that's not true, and that Trump's call was perfect, and that Trump's response to the coronavirus was great and competent, and that, you know, everything Trump does is amazing. That's what they think.
Yeah, it's one thing to kind of to know that in the abstract, as an abstraction, that, oh yes, he says it's fake news and they believe him because he said it. But it's another thing to kind of just to read your book and kind of get into the weeds of their perspective, and how it's just there's a bubble that seems like it's impossible to permeate. That like if a journalist wanted to try and convey to that crowd, to those attendees what's true, it would be, I think, effectively, if not literally, impossible, right?
Yes, I mean, you can't argue with the conspiracy theory. I thought going into this that I would be having these long, substantive conversations with people who were that in hanging out with them for long periods of time, we would be able to have civil, interesting conversations about the merits of big government or small government in the most basic sense. And that was proved to be impossible. I couldn't do that. You can't have a conversation with somebody who believes that Michelle Obama has a penis, or that, Hillary Clinton has, I met this woman in Dallas, Texas, and I liked her. Seemed very normal, and she had traveled and she traveled in India, and she seemed like a sophisticated person, and she, and I said to her, the one thing that really gets me is those conspiracy theories. I said, I don't know what to do with that. And she goes, well, I don't have 99 friends who committed suicide. Do you? And I was like, wait, what is she saying?
Right.
And then I realized she was talking about like the Clintons and Vince, and that, Hillary, I guess, the Clintons murdered all these people, and she said to me, well, I believe Hillary would kill to win. Absolutely. And that is not fringe. That
not
is
them.
That is, a constant, and it goes deep with everyone in the base. And I hate to say it, but it's true. It's a literal fantasy world.
One of the other threads, in addition to conspiracy theories, that came through to me was the issue of race. There was, I won't read from the book, but on page 181, you tell us a fascinating anecdote about this farmer with pecans, the pecan farmer.
Yeah.
And he said some pretty disgusting things that, for you and me would be inherently insulting and offensive, and just kind of leaving a terrible taste in your mouth as you read it. It got me thinking a lot about whether they consider themselves racist, whether do they consider Trump a racist? Is it Trump's racism that kind of helps fuel their affinity for him, or do they just consider themselves above such ugliness?
Well, racism and religion are huge parts of racism, religion, ideas of masculinity, I think, are the most sort of powerful cultural threads. And racism is everywhere. It permeates everything. I mean, a Trump rally is all white. And the first thing that a person will say to you is, I met a lot of nice people. And I hung out with a lot of people who were very kind to me. And if you talk to them, the first thing they say, everybody accuses us of being a racist. I'm not a racist. No, we're not racist. And what they mean by that is, sort of a KKK racist, somebody who runs a night rider or something. But the idea of systemic racism, they just aren't even aware of. And the rally is 22,000 people, and there might be 200 black people there. And the campaign will gather them together and put T-shirts on them, Blacks for Trump, and sit them behind the president so the cameras can see them. And everything is race, everything is code, everything is driving this wedge of xenophobia and racism, and they, they're sort of, they don't admit it, and they don't want to say it, and they don't want to confront it, and they don't believe they're racist. They'll say, well, why should I be held liable for something that happened, 200 years ago? It's a crazy world. But let's talk a little bit about, the imposters, because I that's a perfect segue point. There's a line in your book that says, if there's no truth, how do we discuss and make decisions rooted in fact? And I think that's kind of where there's so many places, but where these books really come together. I mean, talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's true. I mean, I can think of it, but one of the things I document in the book are a series of conversations, for example, that Barack Obama would have at the White House with congressional Republican leaders on any number of issues. And I think that Obama would try and appeal to their intellect and say, well, I'm going to present you with data and evidence, and I'm going to roll out testimonials from the authorities and subject matter experts. And the thinking was that if he could just get through to Republicans on an intellectual level, on a substantive level, that from there you can build some kind of consensus, work towards some kind of compromise, and govern effectively. But I make a joke about him bringing facts to a post-policy fight, because really that all those arguments went right over their heads. He was making arguments to them as if they were members of a governing party when they're not. That these folks we're talking about a group of people who consider the very idea of governing to be foreign and unnecessary and something that they're not prepared to do anyway. They're pundits, and they care about ideology and they care about winning elections, but they are not interested in governing. And I think that in all likelihood that they'd fit in pretty well at those rallies that you attended, because it sounds to me from reading your book that a lot of the people who follow Trump are part and parcel of the same problem, that they're not necessarily concerned about what's the best way to solve problems. They're interested in glorifying leaders and advancing kind of this partisan political agenda, but that's all they're interested in. The governing doesn't enter the picture. Didn't,
at the convention, I mean, here's this whole, you're saying, that the GOP has abandoned substantive policy, and then that's been happening for a long time. And then the convention is launched with no platform.
This to me was a perfect moment. I was.
And speaking of, that also kind of segues into the idea of Trump as the state.
Right. Because exactly, the Republican Party started in the 1850s. They produced their first platform in 1856. Every 4 years since then, they've had a policy agenda. They've cared at least in a superficial way about governing, and they've produced a document that the public can read and scrutinize, saying, here is the party's agenda. You can evaluate it on the merits. Except for in 2020, for the first time since 1856, they said, no, we're not going to bother with that. All we care about is glorifying Trump. Whatever Trump says, that's our platform. If Trump changes his mind, that's our new platform. I thought they were just going to kind of rehash 2016 platform. This year, they didn't even bother. And I really felt like, in some respects, they were proving my point. This is a party that simply did not care.
You don't really need a policy, because Trump is, whatever Trump is and says,
that's the end.
That he's the policy, right?
That's exactly right. And if he changes his mind, that's the policy too. And if he decides that he doesn't care about governing, then the party doesn't care about governing. In fact, it doesn't. I mean, in some respects, I kind of felt like this was an embarrassment for the party, or at least it should have been if they're capable of shame. I mean, when you think about it, this is a party that has this rich tradition of caring about ideas and caring about conservative solutions to problems. And they just forfeited all of that. They just light their credibility on fire and say, we're no longer a governing party. We're not even going to pretend to be a governing party anymore. It was extraordinary. I just found it breathtaking.
Well, I love some of your stories about sort of your examples. Like a couple of them, I love the example of Herman Cain saying he wouldn't allow anything longer than 3 pages. That if he was elected president, he wouldn't allow any law, as my understanding, any law or sort of policy paper longer than 3 pages. And that was such an example of sort of the disdain of the complexity, expertise inherent in government,
Exactly.
Government and governing.
Well, right. I mean, there's a classic example. He was saying that he couldn't be bothered with complexities. Like, if anything was, I was thinking about it in the context of say, like a NASA scientist. If you and I were going to be working on a manual for the lunar module, 3 pages, that's it. Some things are complicated. Healthcare policy is complicated. Immigration, economic policy. These things take time, and it involves people of goodwill rolling up their sleeves and digging in on the weeds and caring about the substantive details. And Herman Cain was one of these folks. And unfortunately, he's not alone in the party, the late Herman Cain, who was saying, you know what? None of that matters. We want something simple. We want something we can fit on a bumper sticker or in a tweet. And that's it, because the alternative is hard work. And really, they're not interested in hard work because that would require them to take governing seriously, and they don't. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a classic example. I'm glad that that resonated with you.
Or, recognizing that there's this novel virus out there that could kill you. And Herman Cain, I mean, I don't want to, but he went to the rally and didn't wear a mask, and he is no longer with us. I mean, it's just crazy. It's like, it's mind-boggling. I also like the one about the June 2017 fake signing ceremony about privatizing air traffic controllers.
It's funny. Signing ceremonies are just a normal part of governing in a normal administration. That Congress passes a bill of significance, the president lines up the pens, and they sign part of their signature and they hand out the pens. It's a thing. It's something that presidents enjoy doing. Given that in the last several years there really haven't been any legislative breakthroughs, in large part I think because Republicans are so indifferent towards governing, so Trump has to make up his own kind of signing ceremonies. And so he announces one day, oh yes, everyone come to the White House. It's going to be a big deal. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to announce a new transportation policy. We're going to privatize the FAA. So the congressional leaders all line up behind him, and he does the whole signing ceremony as if he was playing president, because in fact he was. And so sure enough, he goes through the motions, and they smile for the cameras. Next day, the policy is effectively gone. Congress says we're not privatizing the FAA, and the whole thing was for nothing. It was all for show, because really they were just pretending to be governing, which is why I call them the imposters.
Yeah, it's just all aesthetics in a way. Like, at a Trump rally, one of the most amazing things is when Trump always talks about, he sort of 3/4 into his speech, he talks about healthcare, and he talks about we will never take away your health care, and we will never, get rid of the
protections.
pre-existing conditions. When the GOP is suing to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, whose central policy is making sure the pre-existing conditions are covered.
Well, right. So it's on the one hand, it's just brazenly dishonest. I mean, he is just, I don't know if he knows how, it's hard to say to what degree he understands reality. I don't know if he realizes that his administration is begging the Supreme Court to destroy those benefits, but whether he knows it or not, that's what's happening. And so the fact that he just has this capacity to lie so brazenly is extraordinary. But I also think that this ties in directly with the thesis of my book, which is about governance. When the Affordable Care Act was being legislated, Republicans refused to participate in any meaningful way. Then once it became law, they tried to sabotage it in every possible opportunity. When they actually were in a position to do something about it in 2017, when they controlled the levers of power in the House, Senate, and the White House, they put together this ridiculous bill that ultimately failed because it was so wildly unpopular, and because it ultimately didn't work. It wouldn't have worked. And so here we have a party that says they're so deeply concerned about healthcare, and they saw Obamacare as this national scourge on society. But yet, when given an opportunity to do something about it, they didn't know how. They were basically their governing muscles had atrophied to such a point they couldn't actually pursue their own goals, even when put in a position in which they could have pursued those goals.
Well, so let's say Trump loses, knock on wood, and what happens to the GOP? I mean, how can the GOP be anything but, as you say, post policy, sort of doing this fantasy governing without addressing, issues that sort of strike at the very heart of what the GOP has always, opposed for so long? Like, where can it go? It's sort of painted in a corner, it seems to me.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, they've certainly backed themselves into a position in which they have no real policy agenda. They have no governing priorities. They don't even seem to really know how, if they wanted to try and pursue any of these ideas in practice. I think a lot about political parties and incentives. I think that in general, political science tells us that parties change when voters tell them they have to. Because so long as the parties are winning, they have no incentive to change. They figure, well, if our goal is to win elections and be in power, and we're winning elections, then everything's fine. But when parties start losing, the incentives change. I think that those are the moments in which parties have to kind of take stock and say, oh, well, wait a minute, we've been handed defeat at the ballot box. The electorate isn't buying what we're selling. What are we going to do about it? And so my hope and slash expectation is that if Trump does poorly in 2020, and I think that he will, and if his party does poorly in 2020 elections, and I think that they will, I think the party will find itself at a crossroads. It'll be a reckoning moment. And it'll have to decide what kind of party is it going to be? What kind of priorities are they going to have? What kind of solutions are they going to try and take seriously? And so my hope is that with defeat comes an opportunity. With defeat comes an opportunity to say, okay, being a post-policy party isn't working. Voters didn't like it. We failed it in every meaningful way on every possible issue. What are we going to do about it? And I mean, I think part of the problem is go ahead.
I love your optimism. but sometimes I wonder if, it's like you being Obama talking policy. I mean, it's like the things you're talking about, just, the root of so much of this is this idea that government is the problem and government needs to be cut. Then that's the problem. And yet the thing that makes government work is the thing that they're subverting. I don't know what happens.
Well, but here's the thing. I mean, the Republican opposition to a large federal centralized government is not new. I mean, Reagan ran against the whole idea of big government, and in his joke about how the scariest words being, "I'm here from the government, and I'm here to help." So Reagan ran against it. But yet, when we look back at the Reagan era, I still consider the 1980s Republican Party to be a governing party. I note in the book, for example, when they tackled tax reform in 1986, Republican officials in the White House and on Capitol Hill took the process seriously. They had months of hearings, intense scrutiny that lasted for weeks upon months, for nearly a year. They took the process seriously because they cared about the details. And despite the fact that it was a conservative party that was against governing, in many respects against government, and they nevertheless were able to take the process seriously enough to pursue something worthwhile. And that was in 1986. It's a different party, but the fact that it's against the fact that it's skeptical about big government is not in and of itself it does not necessarily lead to the fact that they're a post-policy party. It doesn't have to be a post-policy party. They're capable of being both a governing party and something that's skeptical of big government itself. I think that there is a needle that they could thread there. They used to be able to, but now they're not. My hope is that someday they'll be able to get back.
When I was in the rallies, I had this feeling that, like a Trump rally and everything Trump, everything. And that, having read your book, now that illuminates it all the more, that this sort of style, this post-policy governing is, I had this thought of like, the difference between a boxing match and a professional wrestling match. And like a boxing match, two guys could go at it for 12 rounds and there's no knockouts, no knockdowns, no one trips. It's just someone wins on points. It can be boring to watch. Whereas, like a wrestling match, people are jumping off the ropes and hitting each other with folding chairs. And that's Trump and the GOP right now. And that people love it in a way, like people at rallies in the base, because it's just so much more, it's this fantasy of governing. But it's not the boring, the boring long fight that where there's no blood and there's no knockouts.
No, I think I like this metaphor a lot, in part because wrestling is fake. It's scripted. It's theatrical. It's intended to be entertaining. And I think for a lot of Republicans, in the Trump White House, on Capitol Hill, there's a sense that governing isn't fun, that there's nothing really to be gained from it. It doesn't make for sexy headlines and chyrons on Fox News. It's unglamorous. And
well, I sorry to interrupt, but I think this is really what really surprised me in your book was you saying that a lot of policy staff had been reduced, and with a great concomitant increase in PR and comms.
Right. And I think I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the pioneers of this in 2009 was a young congressman from Indiana. His name was Mike Pence. I believe you might have heard of him. He's now the vice president. And I think that Mike Pence was one of these guys who said in 2009, let's not worry so much about hiring staffers who will be working on governing and policy making. Let's instead hire people who are going to get us on television and get us on talk radio and help prepare talking points and focus on social media and so on and so on. This was a pivotal moment for the party. I mean, in 2009, the party was at a crossroads. They just gotten their hats handed to them in 2008 and in 2006. My hope, one would like to think that they'd be taking stock of what their priorities are going to be. And instead of focusing on governing, they focused on media. And I think that helped set the stage for, among other things, the rise of Donald Trump, because over the course of the Obama era, the party became less and less engaged on policymaking. And they started taking Mike Pence's advice and hiring fewer policymaking staff and hiring more press flacks. And so it helped open the door for someone like Donald Trump to take advantage of the dynamic in which they didn't care.
So what's chicken and what's egg? I mean, with Donald Trump, I mean, is he the natural outgrowth of this, or, you know, is he just sort of taking advantage of this, and you know, he's just Trump?
From my perspective, I think that he is the natural outgrowth of the party that stopped caring about governing in 2009, and he saw an opening. He was able to land on fertile soil, because from 2009 to 2015 or so, the party had just given up so completely on the idea that the substance of policymaking mattered. Along comes Donald Trump basically saying that he agreed that he wants to be the personification of this idea that governing doesn't matter and details don't matter. What matters is celebrity, and what matters is rallies, and what matters is what's going to be fun and exciting and theatrical. And so he was able to just kind of take advantage of this opportunity that the party had created for him, not knowing that he was going to fill the vacuum, but by then it was too late. He and his rallies were already slowly taking over the party before the party knew what was going on.
You know, one of the things that also, among so many, that just bowled me over at the rallies and was the way in which Trump, first of all, wherever he is, like if he was in Dallas, then there would be, you know, Ted Cruz would be there, Rick Perry would be there, the Texas Secretary of State. I mean, the whole GOP Texas delegation, and then down ballot people would be there. And that, you know, doesn't matter whether it was Kentucky, Mississippi, whatever. And that, you know, he would, first of all, I was surprised that those people would be there, and that so many of them. And then he would take those people in the middle of his speech. He would sort of pause and he would tell us, he would introduce them. And he would introduce them by telling a story, always a story about them and about how he beat them. Like Ted Cruz, you know, how he, how Ted Cruz was the debate champion of Princeton and Harvard. And, you know, Donald was just this working class guy from Queens, you know, who had never been on a debate. You know, he played baseball, right. We said.
Right.
Like, I used to play baseball. And yet, you know, and then he debated Ted Cruz and he crushed him. I mean, he humiliated him. And in saying that, he's humiliating, and Cruz is like literally below Donald Trump at the time. And you know, there's 22,000 people laughing and screaming with him. This isn't done in a vacuum. And, you know, and then, and so I had the sense that, you know, when we're talking about the party as a whole, that he's holding these, you know, the rallies are a way they're all about power, and they are this mechanism by which he dangles people in front of the crowd, and he says, you know, I can give this to you, I can give you 22,000 people, but I can take it away too. It's mine to take it away. And that really reached a crescendo in New Hampshire, my last rally in New Hampshire, when there were so many people. I mean, it was this whole court, and I had this sort of this memory of, you know, Kapuscinski's description of Haile Selassie and his court, and you know, so just trying to think back on the GOP as a whole, it's like he's now kind of wrenching them back into his own sphere of order, into that even more that place of fantasy and make believe. I see.
Go ahead.
Hi, sorry to reappear and interrupt. That was fascinating. It's just We have about 15 minutes left, so I wanted to make sure we had time for the audience Q&A.
Sure.
And so we have a few questions from Crowdcast and some from Facebook. So I'm going to begin with a first one from Sarah on Crowdcast. She asks, so what will happen to people whose primary loyalty is to a particular person when that person is no longer the leader? Do they redirect to a new leader or do they do something else? So in essence, I think she's asking what becomes of Trump's base should Biden win?
Carl, go ahead.
It's like the $1 million question. I don't know. What happens? I mean, you've got all these people, and if Trump loses, I don't see the right-wing ecosphere, from Fox News to OAN to people, Bongino, those people on Twitter who are egging them on. I don't see those people and saying that this is all, a conspiracy. I don't see them going away. So what happens? I don't know. It's a really profound question. Steve?
Yeah, I agree with that. Of course, we were talking earlier, and Carl was teasing me about being optimistic. And it's hard to be optimistic when we realize that we don't know where those folks are going to go. There's no reason to think that they'd be any less conservative. I don't think they're going to be abandoning the far right ideas that they've kind of embraced so enthusiastically in recent years. And I think that the consequence of that is that it'll be that much more difficult for the party to reform. It's that much more difficult for the party to kind of move away from its current post-policy status and into a more governing structure, because they won't have any sense of how to do that in the absence of their leader. So it's cause for concern.
And there's you can't talk about something unless you agree on a standard. A pound is 16 ounces. If we both agree on that, but if I think a pound is 16 ounces and you think a pound is 28 ounces, what can you do? I don't know.
Well, so then I would say the follow-up question, which is from Mitch, would be, what would happen should Trump win and his base basically gives free rein to his authoritarian impulses?
Well, I think that is, I wish I had a better answer. That's a great question. I wish I had an equally good answer. I think that, the problems we see over the last 4 years, from my book's perspective, is that the party is no longer governing. They're not taking policymaking seriously. Problems that need addressing aren't being solved. So what happens if Trump wins? I think we see the same problem intensified, magnified, because it's not as if they're going to look at a victory as an opportunity to reform. We'll see the opposite. We were talking earlier about how parties respond to incentives. And I think at that point, the incentive to change will simply disappear. It'll become worse. It'll become more intense. It'll be the same problem times 10. Carl, would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump has a fundamental urge to authoritarianism. I mean, he's not a man who knows history or the Constitution or believes in any of those things. I mean, it's clear he doesn't. And when you watch him in the rallies, and really that's what my book is all about in the end, is this personality, this big, forceful personality who has to kind of kill to survive. And the most loyal subject is the dead subject. And that's a metaphor. I mean, he's not killing people literally, but he has to win. He has to triumph. He can't do anything. And we see that with the post office, with the ballots. I mean, he'll pull out, he'll go kill. He doesn't want to lose. It's fundamentally like impossible for him to lose. So 4 years unleashed. He has no. There are no guardrails. I think it's a very, very frightening place.
If I just had one quick thought on that. Carl's right that Trump is preoccupied with the fear of defeat. But unlike normal presidents, it's not because he wants to go and work on his agenda in the next 4 years. It's not like he has this list of things he wants to accomplish, or he has these governing goals that he's really eager to implement in order to help the country. It's about him. He wants to win because of Trump. What was that, Carl?
He's a sociopath.
Well, right. But I mean, a typical president running for re-election will talk about all the things that he or she is eager to do with another 4 years in power. We're not hearing any of that right now because Donald Trump doesn't care. That's really kind of the central thesis behind my book.
Yeah, I think so, and it's illuminating. Everybody should read it.
Thank you.
Oh, well, then I would say the follow-up question to that is from Liz, who asks, oh, actually, sorry. The follow-up question would be from Dana, who would say, outside of the pandemic, what do you recommend would be the first steps that the Biden administration takes to address the erosion of government we've seen over the past few years?
I think Steve can answer that.
These questions are hard. I think the first thing that came to my mind is a personnel change. I think that right now, Donald Trump has been in a position where he and his team have been able to try and fundamentally change the nature of how federal government works by putting in people who are not qualified to be there, in part because of their own professional backgrounds, in part because they don't really know what they're doing, and in part because they're kind of sycophantic in their affinity, in their affection for Trump, but they're not in a position in which they're going to be able to govern effectively once he's gone. In fact, they're not able to govern effectively now. And so I think one of Biden's challenges will be overhauling all of the various federal agencies and governments and departments and cabinet agencies that are responsible for governing, and putting people in positions who are competent and capable and care about evidence and data. Because right now, it's not just a question of the individual issues that need addressing. It's going to be about the governmental structure that will be in a position to deal with those issues. And so I think one of the first challenges for a Biden administration, should it exist, would be a personnel challenge, finding the right people and putting them in positions of authority.
And I'll just say, I think this sort of speaks to the earlier questions, and this may be a phase of my own, a little overly optimistic, but, the COVID really is the thing that undermined Trump the most, because he couldn't control it. He couldn't wish it away. I mean, it exposed smoke and mirrors and this upside down world. And I fantasize that were Biden to become elected and Democrats to take the Senate, that there would be just a return to some competence, which I guess speaks to what you just said, Steve, and that relatively quickly, and that people see that, like, things are working. The economy gets better because COVID is being addressed, in a competent way. And so that sort of tames the dragon a little bit. I don't know.
And then, so a related question would be from Liz, who asked, do Democrats play any role in allowing Republicans to abstain from government? Are they abdicating power or fighting ineffectively?
I think Democrats are in a difficult position when it comes to Republicans, because they're not just offering different answers, they're asking different kinds of questions. And it's something that I talk a lot about in my book, because there's no, and Carl was talking about this a few minutes ago, about how there's no real common ground to build on. And so I think that Democrats, when they sit down at the negotiating table, for example, they're talking right past Republicans, and Republicans are talking right past them, because they're not speaking the same language. They're not speaking the language of governing. Republicans are not overly concerned about things like data and evidence and expertise and authority. And so as a consequence, I don't know if it's Democrats necessarily ceding ground, but they're not able to necessarily communicate in a way that Republicans care about, because Democrats care about governing and Republicans don't. And that disconnect, that asymmetry causes a breakdown that I wish the Democrats were in a position where they could do something about that, but they're not. It's not something where Democrats can simply convince Republicans to care, or they can just say, well, here are the facts, join us in reality, and let's work together on these and cooperate on these issues. Democrats aren't in a position to do that because Republicans don't care. They're not a governing party right now. And so I'd love to be able to blame Democrats more for this, but at this point, I don't think that there's anything that they can do responsibly to kind of bring Republicans back to some kind of normalcy. Carl, what do you think?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, having hung out and spent a lot of time with people with Trumpians, and especially, essentially white working class, non-college educated working class men and women. I think there's a level at which the Democrats need to talk to them, and that, Biden needs to speak to them and speak to their anxieties. I mean, I think they have genuine anxieties, whether I think they've failed to, I think a lot of white working class people have had a lot of privilege in a lot of ways, and they've taken that privilege for granted, and that's slipping away in a lot of ways. And, that's not their fault, but still they're feeling those feelings. They're feeling that vertigo. And and they don't feel like anyone's really addressing it. And, which is ironic in a way, but that's another issue. And, Trump rides in and just says, I'm gonna make the world great again. And I'm gonna make it white again. And I'm gonna make it, so that you can make a good living with your hands, and you don't have to go to college, and you don't have to worry about all those, smart Chinese people and smart Indonesians and smart Brazilians who are working in every bit as hard as Americans, and blah, blah, blah. They need to somehow address that. And I haven't really seen that happening. And that worries me a little bit.
So then, on that note, a slightly lighter question from Paula, which is, if we were to take a look separate from parties and actually look at the bases of both the Democrats and Republicans, what is it that unites them?
Carl?
Well, it's terrible the way things are right now. Like, because of this book, I'm trying to be on Twitter a lot. I'm tweeting, and some guy called me a Marxist sock puppet yesterday. And they start just, the vitriol is intense. And what unites us? Everything unites us. We love our children. We love our families. We love sitting around in the evenings with our friends. We have hopes and dreams and aspirations. I've spent, this is the first book I've ever done that's about America and Americans. I spent, for my last book, I hung out with nomads in the middle of Borneo. And before that, I spent months living in a 10,000 square mile swamp, with former headhunters. And the reason I was able to do that is because we're all the same, in the end. So, we have all of these commonalities, and the reason I was able to hang out with the Trumpians, they became friends. I liked them. I liked spending time with them in a weird, odd way, but we couldn't really talk about politics. And somehow, that's the nature of social media and the right-wing ecosphere, I think in particular, Fox, that has driven this. And, it hasn't been helped by Russia and all those things, driven this wedge into, and Trump. Trump is the great divider, and that's his whole thing. And he couldn't ever, if he tried to unite everyone, he would just collapse. So, the reality is, I think we have everything in common. We have everything to share, and more in common than not. And it's a matter of people refocusing on that and exhaling a little bit, and being able to have conversations and hugging their, Trumpian neighbors.
Yeah, I agree with all that enthusiastically. I think that if you were to ask 1,000 Americans what's important to you, you'd see broad consensus. You want affordable health care and quality schools, clean air and clean water. Like that, despite all the political divisions, people kind of all want the same kinds of stuff. They have a great deal in common with people that they disagree with, but they want the same things. They want to have the same benefits, and they disagree on how to get there. And it kind of it ties back into governance and policymaking. But I take some comfort in the fact that in terms of priorities, there's a lot more that we agree on than we disagree on.
Yeah, and I think there's fertile ground, I mean, for people to, I mean, in a way, I think that's why Biden has a chance, and that's why he's doing as well as he is, because he's kind of just this generic figure in a way, or perceived as this kindly, generic figure around which people can kind of rally and hug in a way. And because everybody wants to, because so many people believe in the same things or value the same things.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one last question. So, from Dana, again, strangely, or a different Dana perhaps, we have the question of where do you think America will be in 5 years? A nice heavy one to.
Well, at the risk of having Carl tease me, I am an eternal optimist. I am naive in my optimism, and I think that in 5 years, my hope is that we will be in a better place. Obviously, coronavirus will be a thing of the past. One likes to think. I think the economy will be stronger than it is now. I think that there will. I want to believe that there will be a window of opportunity for real governance to take place, and that we will slowly but surely move in that direction in the 5 years. Carl, tell me how wrong I am.
I don't know, and I wish I knew. What I'll say is that where we are in 5 years depends on what happens in November, and the two choices represent starkly different paths. I believe deeply starkly different, and so.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you both so much for a fantastic and fascinating conversation. Both of your books are available for sale. I've dropped the link into the chat for anyone who has yet to purchase it.
And may I
Please
say
do.
one thing? May I just
Oh,
say
of
one
course.
thing? And I'm always a little embarrassed to say this, but buy the books. That's why we're here.
Amen.
And that's why the Strand is here, and that's how we make our living. Well, it's how I make my living. No, I'm not getting paid to do this. It's all selling books. So please buy the book, buy it for your friends and your relatives. And thank you all so much for coming in. Thank you, Strand, and thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
On that note, thank you everyone and have a good night.